Hey Ron, we're doing an episode of Ask GN. It might be a little bit of echo because we're in a cable car or a gondola going peak to peak at Whistler. This is our last day here after PAX West drove up. And we'll put a timer somewhere in the corner because I'm on a clock for this before we get to the other side. Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Core G21 enclosure from Thermaltake, a $70 case with two 4mm thick tempered glass side panels and a power supply shroud with top-mounted SSD sleds. Learn more at the link in the description below. Okay, so Ask GN, first question. Enigma1 asked Steve, what's the latest on HardwareLuxx's Vega 56 undervolt validation? So that comes from the live stream. Vega 56 undervolting kind of works, but sometimes it doesn't. So in that live stream, you can see that I wasn't able to successfully replicate the results. That doesn't mean the results didn't happen. It means that my card didn't like those numbers. And specifically, here's the thing. It looks like it accepts the undervolt, but if you take a DMM to the back of the card, multimeter, and check the voltages, it'll actually be a bit higher than what you tell it to run at. Some of that's expected, but the voltage wasn't dropping as much as we were telling it to. So it looks like it's working, but I'm not fully confident in it. Basically, I think the software is kind of lying to us like a lot of other things with the Vega software. So I'm not sure about the results. They could be completely valid, but we can't replicate it. Undervolting is just like overclocking. Some silicon likes it, some doesn't. Next question, Foreign says, Steve, I have a question regarding memory bandwidth in GPUs. Different graphics cards can have different bandwidth, like 200, 300, 400 gigabits per second, or gigabytes per second rather. What does that specifically mean? How much data the GPU can move per second or something else, because higher bandwidth doesn't necessarily mean faster cards. So, as quickly as possible, this is the speed at which the GPU can maximally move data to and from memory. Some GPUs care a lot more about memory bandwidth than others. You can look at the Vega GPUs. They get choked on bandwidth, which is provable by overclocking the HBM. And basically what it comes down to is, well, let's do the calculation first. So to calculate memory bandwidth, you take the memory bus width divided by 8, which converts your bits to bytes, makes it a bit easier. And then you multiply that by the memory clock, the actual clock, not the effective one, times 2 for DDR, times 2 for GDDR5. And some architectures are more bound than others, so depending on what number you get, it may not mean anything, it may mean a lot. With Vega, we tend to be limited on bandwidth. With Fury, we tend to be limited. This is getting very high up. And then with some of the NVIDIA cards behave a bit differently. NVIDIA doesn't need the bandwidth quite as much as the Vega architecture does. Part of that is the color compression, memory compression. So as you push and pull data from memory, if you can compress a lot more of that data, you can compress the colors 8:1 even, stuff like that, then you really reduce your reliance on that pipe being wider, the memory bandwidth being larger in numerical value. So the more compression you have, the better off you are. Higher memory bandwidth doesn't mean better card, but it is important for some architectures especially, all eventually at some level. Quick example though, the one I wrote down here. We take a GTX 1060, that's 192 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, 192-bit bus. The equivalence between these two numbers is basically a coincidence. So 192 divided by 8 equals 24 times 8 gigabits per second effective. You get 192 gigabytes per second. Or if you're working from base frequency, which makes more sense, that would be 2002 megahertz. So 192 divided by 8, 24 times 2002 gives you 48,048 times 2 for DDR, 96 gigabytes, times 2 for GDDR5, 192 gigabytes per second. So that's a quick explanation of memory bandwidth. I think we're about halfway through this video. So, yeah, compression matters a lot, but that's the very basics. Maybe we'll do something separate when I'm like not in a car doing this. Streetguru, these are all from Discord today, says, should AMD add an automatic undervolt utility to Wattman wherein the GPU would render a scene at a user-specified frequency, say 1600 megahertz for Vega, then gradually scale down the voltage until it sees instability where it hopefully stops itself to prevent a crash. All the data could then be output to a file where the user could set states in Wattman accordingly. This is a fantastic idea. I hope AMD takes your idea. So volt frequency tuning exists in Precision and in the NVIDIA Pascal and onward cards. There is a volt frequency curve for AMD also. It exists a lot more in Vega than in previous architectures, so it's possible for them to do this. And I would think you'd basically run it through a bunch of checks at different, it'd take a while, run through different frequencies and voltages, see where it's not stable, and output your results from there, and then load them if you want to load them. And if you, I don't know, I think the challenge is, how do you recover from the driver crash? How do you save the states? Do you put it out to a text file for the user, or do you try and do it all for them? That's the challenge. But they have plenty of other things to work on the driver side, so not sure that'll come anytime soon. But next question is from Contractor316, who says, Steve, do you know if there's any qualitative performance and or power consumption difference between using a single split PCI-e cable or two separate PCI-e cables to power the graphics card, and what's the effect on the power supply? So, not really. So this is just, you don't really want to daisy chain cables. That's what you're talking about, is where you have one that splits. We did that in the Cooler Master C700P build that we did at PAX this past weekend. And I did it because it was cleaner. But, I mean, if you're trying to be technically correct, using two separate cables would be better. It's just a matter of, are you exceeding the amount of power that the gauge of that cable can handle? Generally, the answer is no. You're probably going to be fine, but if you're working with, say, an overclocked Kingpin card or a high overclock Lightning Z, something like that, you're pushing enough power where it's probably time to use two separate cables, reduce the heat load on the cables so that you're not burning through your wire by pushing 300 watts through it or something like that. And they can handle more than the PCIe spec says that they can handle, but there's no reason to beat the cables up like that if you're going to run an extreme overclock or a high overclock. You'll improve your stability a little bit as you approach the upper limit of the cables. You'll reduce the heat load on that specific cable. Rails come into play here too, 12-volt rails. Maybe we can get BuildZoid to talk a bit about that sometime in the future and do some demonstrations of what happens when you do use a daisy-chained cable. Can you make it catch fire or melt or anything like that? You can, it just depends on what kind of hardware you're working with, and if you are, well, the demonstration part's hard because you don't want to damage the high-end card, obviously, that can produce that much current and power. So that's the concern with that. But yeah, I think it just comes down to, like, if you're working with lower wattage cards, you'll be fine with a daisy chain, but just try to do two separate cables. So that's most of the questions I had here for today, and this thing's still going, so we can add a couple more. Let's talk about the undervolting a bit more. And so the back of the card, undervolting, the first question that I talked about, we'll have I can put a photo, have Andrew put a photo in the video of the voltage checkpoints on the back, and you can check for HBM2 voltage, and you can check for V-core. So take the, on the DMM, take the black and stick it into a ground on a Molex cable. That's probably the easiest. You want it to be as close to the source as possible. And then take the red and probe the back of the card. You can check HBM2 voltage, you can check V-core. They will be a little bit higher than what software tells you, because of where you're checking in the stage. But that will give you a better idea of if your voltage is actually changing from the undervolting. This is probably more accessible than the other solution, which is take a current clamp the cables and check the current. Ideally, you do both to make sure that the power actually goes down, which tends to coincide with voltage because volts times amps equals watts. So if you see one go down, probably the other one went down. But just to really make sure, check the voltage on the back of the card. You'll see a bit higher than software, but it should go down each time you step it down in software relative to each other. So if you drop 10 millivolts, you should drop 10 millivolts in the back of the card readout, or roughly thereabouts. So that would be something I'd suggest. We'll have a photo to show you where you check those yourself if you want to. You remove the back plate and then you're good to go on that. We're approaching the end here, I think. So if you want to check out content that was from Whistler, like the bike park, check the GN Steve channel. We'll leave a link below. You can subscribe to that one. I think we're going to start building that one up a little bit more for non-Gamers Nexus content. Stuff that's like kind of related, like the riding down the mountain while talking about Coffee Lake and things like that. That's probably about the most related we'll get. So check out the GN Steve channel for that. Hope the echo wasn't too bad for you all. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly. I will see you all next time.